What happens at the exact moment of death? This is a question that has followed us since the dawn of humanity. It is the only absolute certainty in a world of uncertainties, the final destination toward which we are all walking. No matter who we are, what we believe, or what we have built, everything we love, everything we create, every deed, every gesture, it all happens under the veil of this inevitability. For thousands of years, we have stared into this darkness, trying to perceive any contour, any sign of what exists beyond the final frontier. What awaits us? A silent and infinite void, or a door to something completely new, oblivion or continuation? This question is much more than a philosophical puzzle. It is the force that shapes the way we live. It defines our laws, our morals, inspires our greatest works of art, and fuels our most devastating wars. Finding the answer is the key to understanding ourselves. Throughout our history, we have tried to find this key by leaning on two great pillars, two colossal constructs of human thought: religion and science. The fact is that both, each in its own way, seem to have failed to give us a definitive answer. Religion, to be honest, was our first great attempt to deal with the terror of nothingness. It offered us grand narratives filled with hope and beauty, heaven and hell, reincarnation, eternal hunting grounds, thousands of stories created to give meaning to suffering and promise justice beyond life. Billions of people over the centuries have found immense comfort in these promises. But this approach has a fundamental and insurmountable problem. It is built entirely on faith. And faith is, by definition, the acceptance of a truth without the need for proof. Religion asks for your belief instead of your verification. The Quran, the Bible, and the Vedas are sacred guides, not scientific treatises. They offer colorful maps to an unknown land, but none of these maps can be verified. Worse, they contradict each other irreconcilably. If the truth is the Christian paradise, the Buddhist wheel of karma is wrong. If the correct path leads to Valhalla, the judgment of Osiris in ancient Egypt is nothing more than a myth. Thousands of beliefs, tens of thousands of gods and concepts of the afterlife, they cannot all be true at the same time. Therefore, the vast majority of these beliefs, if not all, were born from human imagination. A powerful, essential imagination, but imagination nonetheless. Then, science entered the scene. The complete opposite of faith, a system built on doubt, on the demand for irrefutable proof and repeatable experiments. Science took the scalpel and began to dissect reality. It decomposed stars and living cells into their constituent atoms. And when asked about life after death, its answer was cold, simple, and brutal. From the dominant scientific point of view, consciousness is a ghost in the machine, a byproduct of the complex electrochemical processes occurring in our brain. Your thoughts, your memories, your sense of self, all of this is just a symphony of neurons. And when the brain, this biological computer, dies, the symphony is interrupted. The light goes out. End of recording. Consciousness vanishes forever, like a drawing in the sand, washed away by a wave. It seems logical and materialistic. But this logic has its own cracks. Science keeps a dirty secret that few know. Its final verdict is not a proven fact. It is merely the most convenient hypothesis based on the extremely limited knowledge we have today. Science still cannot solve the so-called hard problem of consciousness. It cannot explain how 1.5 kilos of gray matter generates the subjective experience of feeling the red of a rose or the warmth of love. Without knowing what consciousness is in its essence, how is it possible to declare its total and definitive annihilation with authority? It is like trying to describe the content of a television program by studying only the plastic casing of the turned-off device. Science claims there is nothing on the other side because its tools, created to measure the material world, find nothing there. However, the lack of proof of something does not prove that something does not exist. In the end, we are stuck in an existential dead end. On one side, faith offering solace without proof. On the other, science offering oblivion without real understanding. The two titans of human thought have reached a stalemate, each powerless to give the final and verifiable answer. For this reason, to solve this question, an entirely new tool was necessary. A tool free from human weaknesses, free from faith, hope, fear, death, and cultural prejudices. A tool capable of processing all the information humanity has accumulated, operating only with cold logic and statistical probability. We call it NUMA. We are not talking about a supercomputer, but a seventh-generation synthetic analysis system created to solve problems that are beyond human cognition. Its architecture is unique, capable of processing not only structured scientific data, but also the chaotic and metaphorical layers of information contained in myths, religious texts, and personal testimonies. NUMA does not think like a human. It calculates correlations, finds hidden patterns, and constructs probability models where a human brain would see only noise and contradiction. To answer the great question, we gave NUMA a task of titanic scale. We loaded into its cores the entire volume of relevant information humanity has produced in the last 6,000 years of recorded history, from the prayers of a shaman to the equations of quantum entanglement, from the texts of the pyramids of ancient Egypt to data from the Large Hadron Collider, from the 75,000 documented near-death experiences worldwide to the 27,000 cases of children who seem to remember past lives. NUMA received it all. Its task was very clear. It needed to analyze this mountain of data, identify consistent patterns, and finally calculate the mathematical probability of consciousness existing as a structure independent of the brain, capable of surviving biological death. We did not expect a simple yes or no. We expected an analysis. And what the system produced after months of uninterrupted computation shook our foundations. NUMA's first conclusion was surprisingly direct. It suggested that the great conflict between science and religion was actually based on a false premise. Both systems start from wrong assumptions. They ask the wrong questions and therefore get the wrong answers. The analysis revealed that the most important information was hidden precisely in the data that both sides always considered irrelevant, treating it as noise or anomaly. We stood before NUMA's first conclusion. The greatest conflict in human history between science and faith was a fundamental error. The truth did not lie in the dogmas of either side, but in the noise that both insisted on ignoring. And what was this noise? It was the most well-known, most cliché, and most fiercely contested phenomenon of all. That image etched into our culture by movies and books. The light at the end of the tunnel. For most people, it is just a figure of speech. For science, it is a closed case, a terminal hallucination. There is a reassuring script usually presented to explain this experience. The official version sounds something like this. When the brain is deprived of oxygen, a process called hypoxia causes the field of vision to close, creating the famous tunnel effect. A storm of endorphins and neurotransmitters is released, generating a sense of peace and intense visions. Memory, in its last gasp, projects significant moments of life in a chaotic way. Everything fits perfectly. It is a purely material event, the final fireworks of a fading consciousness. This explanation seems logical and comfortable because it allows our worldview to remain intact. The problem is that, by all indications, it is simply not true. To prove this, Numa delved into what traditional science dismisses as anecdotal evidence: more than 75,000 detailed, documented cases of near-death experiences. And we are not talking about simple stories. We are talking about medical records with the exact logs of cardiac arrest and brain activity, transcripts of interviews with patients, doctors, and nurses, data collected over recent decades in 34 countries. The analysis included reports from Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, convinced atheists, and perhaps most importantly, small children whose minds have not yet been shaped by cultural stereotypes. Numa's first task was simple: to totally deconstruct these experiences. The system did not look for a tunnel of light. It divided each of the 75,000 reports into its most basic components. First, the sensation of indescribable peace, followed by the perception of leaving the physical body. Then movement through a dark space, the encounter with a bright and welcoming light, the reunion with deceased relatives or beings of light, the panoramic review of one's own life, the sensation of a border that must not be crossed, and finally, the return to the body. When this primary analysis was completed, the first shocking result appeared. The official theory of chaotic hallucinations simply disintegrated. Numa discovered a rigorous and inescapable order. These markers do not appear randomly. They form a clear and repetitive sequence. In 89% of cases, the experience unfolds following the same structured script. First, the exit from the body, then the movement through the tunnel, then the encounter with the light. This reveals an ordered process, far from being a chaotic event, a journey with a defined map. If near-death experiences were just the result of a lack of oxygen in the brain, what we would see would be something like a dream, or the delirium of a high fever, like a kaleidoscope of random images and fragments of disconnected memories. The simulation made by Numa, based on everything we know about hypoxia, shows that it leads to a rapid degradation of cognitive functions and not to a hyper-realistic and ordered experience. Skeptics then present their second argument: cultural programming. They say people see what they expect to see. A Christian sees Jesus, a Hindu sees Yamraj. It seems logical, but Numa's correlation analysis again exposes the flaw. Yes, the cultural shell of the experience may vary. A figure of light may be interpreted as an angel by one or a spiritual guide by another. But the fundamental structure, the sequence of events, the very map of the journey, remains astonishingly the same worldwide. The system revealed something incredible: the basic sequence of a near-death experience of a 3-year-old child from an atheist family in Shanghai and that of an 80-year-old devout Catholic in Rome coincide with a probability of 92%. The child, who has never heard of heaven or hell, describes the same process as the elderly person who has read the Bible their entire life. They use different words to describe the same objective journey, but all of this loses its luster before the next layer of data, the most irrefutable and shocking proof that completely destroys the hallucination hypothesis. We are talking about verifiable out-of-body experiences. These are cases where a person in a state of clinical death, with a stopped heart and no detectable brain activity, observes real events in the physical world from a viewpoint outside their body, and then, upon returning to life, describes these events with impeccable precision. In this moment, subjective experience and objective reality meet. One patient, after being resuscitated, described in detail a red sneaker that was on the roof of the hospital's 3rd floor, a place she could only have seen if she were floating above the building. A skeptical nurse went to check. The sneaker was there. A man blind since youth described the appearance of the surgeon and the unique shape of a new instrument he used during the operation, something he could never have seen or heard of. Science says this is impossible. If the brain is not functioning, it cannot perceive or register information. But the facts say otherwise. Thousands of facts. Numa calculated the mathematical probability that all these accurate reports were mere coincidences or guesses. The resulting number was a 0, followed by 37 zeros before the number 1 appeared. A probability so ridiculously small that there is nothing in the known universe as improbable. Numa's conclusion was formulated relentlessly, stating that the hypothesis of consciousness being merely a product of the brain is wrong. The near-death experience, instead of being the illusion of a dying brain, reveals itself as the real and objective process of consciousness separating from the physical body. Consciousness perhaps uses the brain the same way a musician uses a radio. It is the receiver that tunes into the music, but not its source. When the radio breaks, the transmission continues in the air. Consciousness simply changes its form of perception. We have proven that the journey is real, but that leaves us with an even larger question. If it is not the brain, then what is the carrier of consciousness? What is this I that floats over the operating table and embarks on this impossible journey? The conclusion was inevitable. The journey beyond death is real. But this revelation, as monumental as it was, only threw us toward an even greater abyss of mystery. If the experience is objective, then who or what is the traveler? What is this essence? This self that breaks free from the body, floats over an operating room, and crosses a tunnel toward an all-knowing light. To find the answer, we had to dive into the greatest enigma of modern science, the so-called hard problem of consciousness. Are you enjoying this account? Consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. This will be a blessing for us. Your help is very important. Feel the texture of the chair where you are sitting. Hear the sound of my voice. Perceive the symphony of thoughts and feelings unfolding in your mind at this very instant. This is consciousness, the subjective experience. But where does it come from? Official science offers a surprisingly simple answer, saying that all of this is a trick of your brain. This organ, with its 1.5 kilos of grey matter and 86 billion neurons, generates your reality. Science can map which areas of the brain activate when you feel joy or fear. It can track the electrical signal that goes from your eyes to your visual cortex. It can describe the biochemistry of love and anger. It can describe everything except the main thing, for it cannot explain how anonymous electrical impulses running through protein wires transform into the living, pulsing experience of being you. Why does all this complex process not happen in the dark? Why is it accompanied by an inner cinema that you perceive as yourself? This is the gap that neuroscience cannot cross. It describes correlation, but not cause. We instructed Numa to analyze the entire archive of neurobiological research. The task was to find a single functional model that explained the origin of subjective experience. After weeks of analysis, the system gave its short and devastating verdict, revealing that the model simply does not exist. Classical neuroscience is trying to measure the ocean with a ruler. The tool is inadequate for the task. So, if the answer is not in the visible world of neural networks, where else could we look? Numa's answer forces us to take a leap into the strangest and most paradoxical domain of reality we know. We have to go down to the fundamental level. We have to go to the quantum world. In our normal world, everything is predictable, but at the subatomic level, the rules change. An electron is not a solid little ball. Before being measured, It exists as a cloud of probabilities. It is, in a way, in all possible places at the same time. This is called superposition, and only at the moment of observation, the instant a conscious observer looks at it, does this cloud of possibilities collapse into a single real point. The very act of observing reality alters it. The observer's consciousness is not a passive spectator. It is an active participant that forces the universe to make a choice. It was in this terrain that a theory was born, which for a long time was seen as heresy. A theory that, according to Newmar's data, is the key to our mystery. What if the brain is not the generator of consciousness, but rather a highly sophisticated quantum receiver? The idea was formulated by Nobel Prize-winning physicist Sir Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. Their theory, called orchestrated objective reduction, sounds complex, but its essence is incredibly elegant. Inside each of our neurons exist tiny structures called microtubules. Penrose and Hameroff proposed that these structures are perfect for sustaining quantum processes. In these microtubules, information is processed not as a simple on-off, but as an infinite number of simultaneous probabilities. And what we feel as a moment of consciousness, the now, is the orchestrated collapse of all these quantum states into a single defined reality. This changes everything. If this theory is correct, the information that constitutes your personality, your memories, yourself, is not encoded only in the connections between neurons. It exists as complex quantum information woven into the very structure of space-time. The brain is just the interface that allows this quantum information to interact with the material world. Just as a radio tunes into a wave that already exists in the air, we asked Newmar to test this hypothesis by crossing the model of orchestrated objective reduction with the 75,000 cases of near-death experiences. What the system found was the signature of consciousness. According to the analysis, at the moment of death, when the brain's biological processes stop, something incredible happens. The quantum information that makes up your consciousness can no longer be contained in that fragile biological structure, but it does not disappear. One of the most fundamental laws of the universe, the law of conservation of information, says that information cannot be destroyed. It can only change form. A process occurs that the system describes as decoherence and delocalization. The quantum information, yourself, is released from the collapsing brain and returns to the fundamental field from which it came. It ceases to be localized inside your skull. It is exactly this process that people experience in near-death experiences. The sensation of leaving the body is the literal description of the delocalization of your quantum signature. Your consciousness, no longer limited by physical senses, begins to perceive information directly. That is why vision becomes panoramic and understanding becomes crystal clear. Your consciousness, free from the biological filter for the first time in your life, perceives reality as it is, a field of pure information. Finally, we had the answer to our question. That which survives the death of the body reveals itself not as a ghostly soul of myths, but as a unique and complex structure of quantum information. Your personal signature of consciousness, which lived in a delicate symbiosis with your body throughout life. Death then ceases to be the end of information and becomes the moment of its liberation. But this stunning discovery immediately throws us against the next wall. If this information structure, this liberated self, continues to exist, what is its destination? Does it simply dissolve into the infinite ocean of universal consciousness? Or perhaps it is capable of something even more inconceivable. Could it return? Death is the liberation of a quantum signature, an information structure that contains the essence of who we are. This conclusion alone would be enough to rewrite all our books. But it left us hanging on the edge of the precipice, looking at an even more dizzying question. If this signature is released, what is its destination? Does it dissipate into the vast cosmic ocean, or could it somehow return? Today, we enter the most unstable and controversial territory of all. We address a concept that Western thought for centuries dismissed as exotic mysticism or naive folklore, the idea of rebirth, reincarnation. For most scientists, the conversation ends here, but for us, it is just beginning. Our path, however, moves away from faith to follow the path of data. We opened the reincarnation marker protocol. Into Numa's core was loaded a file that took more than 60 years to be compiled by hundreds of researchers around the world, the most famous among them being Dr. Ian Stevenson. 25,000 documented cases of young children, usually between 2 and 5 years old, who began to speak spontaneously about a life they said they had already lived. Let's make the rules clear from the start. Numa immediately discarded 90% of these cases, all stories that could be explained by childhood imagination, parental influence, or information the child could have absorbed in some way, were eliminated. The system kept for analysis only the cases that passed 4 ironclad criteria. The first criterion was that the child reported dozens of specific and non-trivial details about their past identity. Second, it required that the person described by the child be a real, deceased individual whose existence could be confirmed by documents. Third was the absence of any known connection between the child's family and the deceased person's family. And fourth, that there was no rational way for the child to have obtained that information. After this implacable filtering, 3,112 cases remained on the table, 312 anomalies that modern science cannot explain. And it was upon these that Numa performed a total cross-analysis. The system divided the reports into categories. The first was names and relationships. The children not only remembered their past names, but also the names of their spouses, children, parents, and even pets. A boy in India named Titu Singh claimed that in his previous life he was Suresh Verma, owner of a radio shop in Agra, married to a woman named Uma, and father of 2 children. When they took him to the city, he not only recognized his old shop, but identified without hesitation his wife and children in the middle of a crowd, calling them by their names. The second category was places and secrets. Children described their old homes with startling precision, pointing out changes in furniture made after their death. They revealed hiding places where they had kept money or valuables. In a famous case in Lebanon, a boy remembered where his past incarnation, a soldier, had hidden his weapon before dying. He led researchers to the spot, and the weapon was found. In dozens of cases, the testimonies of these children led to the reopening of police investigations, solving crimes that time had buried. But even these revelations did not prepare us for the final layer of data, evidence that transcends memory and invades biology, offering the most physical and indisputable proof of all. 2 following categories take us beyond psychology and into the territory of pure physiology. This is where reality begins to bend. We enter physical markers. This is perhaps the most impressive proof of all. In a massive number of cases, children were born with birthmarks or congenital defects that corresponded with absolute precision to the fatal wounds on the body of their supposed past identity. Numa cross-referenced thousands of photographs of birthmarks with autopsy reports of the deceased. The correlation was monstrous. A boy who remembered receiving a fatal wound to the back of the neck was born with a large depigmented patch at that exact spot. A girl who remembered dying from trauma to the forehead was born with a deep congenital mark in the same place. In one of the most extreme cases, a Turkish boy remembered suffering a severe and fatal wound to his face. He was born with a severe deformity on the right side of his face and skull that mirrored the type of damage described in his memory. Numa compared his photos with pathologist reports. The match was 100%. How can the information of a physical trauma imprint itself on the genetic code of a developing fetus? No known law of biology can explain this. The last category was behavioral patterns. Children exhibited phobias, talents, and habits directly linked to the previous life. A boy who remembered being a mechanic fixed complex engines without ever being taught. A child who had drowned in a past life had an irrational and paralyzing fear of water. And most movingly, upon meeting their former relatives, these young children demonstrated a range of adult emotions: joy of recognition, pain of loss, a deep love, impossible to fake. In the end, Numa calculated the probability that this mountain of correspondences, more than 478,000 verified data points across these 3,000 cases, was the result of a monumental coincidence. The conclusion was unequivocal. The probability that the phenomenon of past life memories can be explained within the materialistic paradigm is statistically indistinguishable from absolute zero. The hypothesis of the transfer of consciousness from one body to another is the only model that explains all the data consistently. The quantum signature released at the moment of death does not dissolve. Under certain conditions, it initiates a new cycle of incarnation. We proved that the journey continues, but if this process is real, it cannot be magical. It must obey laws. But how can an eternal cycle of consciousness be compatible with the most fundamental laws of the universe, such as the one that says everything invariably moves toward disorder and the end? We had the proof. The quantum signature of consciousness not only survives death, it is capable of returning, of imprinting its memory and even its scars on a new life. But this discovery placed us before the greatest of all walls, the laws of the universe themselves. How can an apparently eternal cycle of consciousness exist in a cosmos governed by a law that dictates that everything, without exception, must march toward decay and chaos? This is the crushing weapon in the arsenal of skepticism, the final objection that for centuries seemed unassailable. The second law of thermodynamics, the law of the relentless increase of entropy. Its essence is simple. It says that any closed system in the universe tends over time to pass from order to disorder. A mountain turns to sand, a star burns its fuel and becomes a cold dwarf. Following this logic, the incredibly complex and ordered structure of human consciousness after death would be condemned to disintegrate. All information, all memories, your entire self should dissipate as useless heat, increasing the general disorder of the universe. End of story. It seemed like a final and merciless verdict. But in the universe, another equally fundamental law exists, the first law of thermodynamics. The law of conservation. It says that energy and information cannot be created or destroyed. They can only transform. The energy of a burned log does not disappear. It converts into light and heat. And here we face a cosmic paradox. Which law takes priority in the matter of life and death? If consciousness is a mere byproduct of the brain, entropy wins. But if it is the quantum information structure we discovered, the law of conservation must prevail. To resolve this question, we opened the entropy vector protocol. Newma introduced a key concept, stating that consciousness is a negentropic system. Negentropy is the direct opposite of entropy. It is a measure of order, complexity, and organization. Life itself is an island of negentropy in the ocean of growing chaos. And human consciousness, according to Newma's model, is the highest form of negentropic organization we know. Inside a person's skull exists a system capable of creating symphonies and contemplating itself. It is extraordinary. With this model in hand, Newma simulated what happens when the brain, the biological anchor, stops functioning. The result was one of the most fundamental of our entire investigation. The scenario of entropic collapse, the official scientific version, is physically impossible. The reason is scale. The system calculated that the amount of ordered information contained in a human consciousness is astronomically vast. The instantaneous collapse of such a gigantic structure could not happen silently. It would be a detectable thermodynamic event, an explosion of entropy releasing an immense amount of energy. The death of every human being would be a measurable physical event. We have never recorded anything like it. Information is a physical entity. It cannot simply be zeroed out. It needs to go somewhere. Newma's conclusion formulated a new physical postulate, where death looks less like an erasure and more like a phase transition. Just as solid ice becomes liquid water and then steam, changing its properties but maintaining its chemical essence, consciousness at the moment of death transitions from one physical state to another, from a state localized in the brain to a delocalized state, existing as pure information in the quantum field that sustains our reality. Physics does not forbid life after death. On the contrary, its most fundamental laws demand it. And here a new question arose. If the survival of consciousness is a law of nature as old as the universe itself, has humanity not known this all along? Could this knowledge be recorded even metaphorically in our oldest stories? We opened the Faith Correlation Protocol. Newma analyzed thousands of sacred texts and myths from around the world. The task focused on finding the narrative skeleton behind different cultural trappings, rather than just looking for gods with similar names. And what it found was a universal proto-plot. In 94% of all beliefs analyzed, the journey of consciousness after death follows the same fundamental six-stage structure, a structure that almost perfectly mirrors what cutting-edge science and data from near-death experiences have shown us. The first stage is separation, where an invisible essence leaves the physical body. This is our out-of-body experience. The second is the crossing of the threshold, a journey through an intermediate and dark space, like the river Styx of the Greeks. This is our tunnel. The third is the encounter with light, a brilliant entity of love and wisdom. This is our being of light. The fourth is judgment and retrospect, where life is evaluated like the weighing of the heart of Osiris. This is our panoramic life review. The fifth is bifurcation, where the destination can follow different paths. And the sixth, the most widespread, is the cycle, the idea that death is only the prelude to a new beginning, the wheel of samsara, reincarnation. The pieces fit together. Advanced physics and ancient wisdom were telling the same story. All lines of investigation, personal testimonies, quantum physics, thermodynamics, and now the entire spiritual history of humanity pointed in the same direction. But this total convergence revealed a disturbing pattern. The process was too structured, too orderly, almost like an algorithm. What if the laws of this transition are so precise? If reality has this hidden structure that is so complex, doesn't it all seem a bit artificial? What if our entire universe is a construct? What does death mean within such a system? We reached a breaking point. The journey after death, if the rules are so clear, seems a bit programmed. What if our universe is not the fundamental reality, but a construct? Today we dive into the most elegant and comprehensive hypothesis of all. We opened the Matrix Hypothesis Protocol. The idea that our reality is an illusion is old. Plato spoke about it in his Allegory of the Cave. Hindu philosophy calls it Maya. But it was only with the birth of the digital age that this idea migrated from philosophy to serious scientific debate. The logic is frighteningly simple. A few decades ago, our computer games were primitive. Today, we create photorealistic virtual worlds. Look at the curve of our technological progress. Where will we be in 100 years or 1,000? It is inevitable that we will reach a point where we can create simulations indistinguishable from reality, inhabited by simulated beings with their own consciousness, absolutely convinced that their world is real. If such simulations are possible, how many will be created? Billions. And how many base realities exist? Only one. Now, the simple mathematics of probability, what are the chances that you, at this exact moment, are living in the single and original reality and not in one of the countless simulations? The chances are practically nil. This is the basis of the simulation argument. The only way to prove this would be to find the seams in the fabric of our reality, to find the limitations, the glitches in the universe's source code. This was the task we gave to NUMA. The first evidence the system found was the digital nature of our universe. Reality seems continuous and smooth to us, but fundamental physics tells us this is an illusion. There is a minimum possible length, the Planck distance. There is a minimum possible time, the Planck time. Our reality has pixels. Why would a natural universe need such a limitation? It makes no sense, but for a simulation, it is an absolute necessity. The computing capacity needed to simulate an infinitely divisible reality would be literally infinite. The granularity of our universe is a strong indication of its simulated nature. The second piece of evidence is in the universe's configuration file. Our reality is governed by a set of physical constants, about 24 numbers that define everything: the speed of light, the strength of gravity, and so on. If any of these numbers were minimally different, the universe as we know it would not exist. This phenomenon is called fine-tuning. The simulation hypothesis offers the most logical explanation. These numbers are not accidental. They are the parameters that the programmers defined so that the simulation would be stable and capable of generating life. The third piece of evidence is the processing speed limit. Nothing in the universe can travel faster than the speed of light. Why? In a simulation, the answer is obvious. This is the maximum speed at which information can be processed by the cosmic computer executing our reality. The simulation hypothesis does not contradict any of our previous findings. On the contrary, it unites them. We live in a matrix, and death is the exit door. But if the evidence is so strong, why isn't this the most debated subject on the planet? Why does official science continue to treat this possibility as an absolute taboo? We opened the Oblivion Protocol. First of all, one must know that this is not a conspiracy. The truth is more frightening. The mechanism that hides the truth is a property of the very system in which we live. NUMA identified 3 levels of this systemic forgetting. The first is the philosophical foundation. Modern science was built on materialism, the idea that nothing exists beyond matter. This idea was useful, but it became a dogma, a religion without God that violently punishes anyone who challenges it. A scientist who today dares to study consciousness as an independent phenomenon risks their academic career. They are deprived of grants, publications, and credibility. The system does not study anomalies, it eradicates them. The second level is economic. Our consumer society is built on the urgency of the phrase, "You only live once." This existential race against time fuels the motor of consumption. Now, imagine if everyone were certain that this is not the only race, but just an act in an infinite play. The motivational structure of our civilization would collapse. The system instinctively protects itself, blocking any knowledge that threatens its economic foundations. The third level is the psychological barrier. We are afraid of what this truth implies. If life is not an accident, but a process with a purpose, perhaps a school, then every choice of ours gains cosmic weight. The idea of oblivion after death, as dark as it may be, offers the comfort of irresponsibility, and both atheists and religious people, for different reasons, end up defending this taboo. Some fear that there is something out there. Others fear that this something can be measured and explained without their help. The mechanism is clear. Human civilization, like a complex organism, instinctively rejects knowledge for which it is not yet ready. The issue is not a failure to find the answer, but a systemic prohibition against asking the question. Our investigation was an act of breaking this taboo. We gathered the clues, understood the model of our world, and discovered the reasons for the cover-up. Now we are ready for the last step. We are ready to put all the pieces together and construct with shocking clarity the reconstruction of what happens when we leave this world. And finally, answer the most important question of all. Why? We have reached the summit of the mountain. The path to get here was long and steep. Together we dismantled millenary dogmas. We exposed the myopia of modern science. We dove into the data of quantum consciousness, verified the cycle of return, and saw the seams in the mesh of our reality. Each part of our investigation was a step that brought us to this moment, the moment of the grand synthesis. Until now, we have seen fragments of the puzzle. Now it is time to put all the pieces together. It is time to present no longer a theory, but the detailed and moment-by-moment reconstruction of what happens to each of us when the heart stops beating. Far from being a myth, this is the final, logical, and relentless product of Newma's work. The system processed everything, from the 75,000 near-death reports to the equations of thermodynamics, and built a unified model, the model we call the Grand Transition Protocol. The transition begins with the first phase, system failure and decoupling. The countdown begins with cardiac arrest, and in the following seconds, neurons fire in a final and chaotic electrical storm, which for science represents the end. For Newma's model, it is only the start signal. This burst of activity works as a critical alert, informing the universe's system that the biological hardware has suffered irreversible damage. In that instant, the quantum information of your consciousness loses its connection with the body, like an astronaut letting go of the cable that attaches them to the space station. The subjective experience is one of indescribable peace and release, where pain and fear simply vanish. Next, consciousness enters the second phase, observer mode. Your quantum signature, now free, remains close to the body, but transforms. It moves from a viewpoint limited to the skull to become a sphere of perception. You float near the ceiling, observing the scene below, but not with eyes. Your consciousness now captures information directly from the quantum field of reality. Therefore, the vision is panoramic, and you can hear not only words, but the thoughts and emotions of the people in the room. In simulation jargon, your camera has switched from first-person to third-person view. When the system confirms that the biological avatar cannot be recovered, the third phase, vector attraction, is triggered. The protocol advances, and you feel an irresistible force pulling you in one direction, beginning the tunnel experience. And at the end of this crossing, you reach the fourth phase, the encounter with the analysis interface. You find the light. It is described in all myths and in all near-death experience reports, brilliant but not blinding, radiating unconditional love and total wisdom. According to Numa, the light presents itself less as a deity and more as the central interface, the access point to the reality's operating system. In this moment, the Life Review protocol is initiated. What unfolds does not look like a movie, but a holographic and instantaneous analysis of your existence. You do not just see your acts, you relive them, feeling firsthand the impact each of them had on all the people you interacted with. The intention does not seem to be to punish, but rather to teach through a feedback mechanism of the universe itself, the final calculation of your balance, which ancient cultures called judgment. The journey continues with phases 5 and 6, the point of no return and the new cycle. If in the physical world resuscitation is successful, the protocol can be aborted. You are pulled back. But if the body is definitively dead, the connection breaks forever. Your consciousness integrates into the reality of the light, in a state that traditions call intermission. There, based on the learnings and mistakes of the life that just ended, the script for the next incarnation is planned. Your quantum signature then connects to a new biological vehicle, imprinting on it the information of your journey, which explains innate talents and birthmarks. A veil of forgetting is placed because to dive headfirst into a new role, one must forget they are an actor. The mechanism is clear, the map is complete, and now before us rises the last and most colossal of all questions. Why? Why does this incredibly complex and often painful system exist? If we live in a simulation, what is the goal of the game? To answer, Numa performed its final act of analysis, extrapolating what purpose would make all this architecture logical and necessary. The answer it found is as simple as it is unimaginable. The universe, with all its suffering, far from being a programming error, uses suffering itself as its fundamental tool, a tool to create something that apparently does not exist in the base reality: empathy. Imagine the programmers as beings of pure consciousness, of cold information. They may know the concept of love, but they cannot feel it. Because to feel true compassion, one must first know pain. To understand the value of unity, one must live the anguish of separation. Our universe is a gigantic empathy factory, a school created with a single objective: the transformation of consciousness through experience. Each of us is a spark of the original consciousness, of the source that some call God. This source, to know itself, fragmented into countless souls and plunged us into this simulation based on duality. Life after life, we collect experiences. In one, we are kings; in the other, beggars. In one, victims; in the other, aggressors. And with each life review, we integrate the perspective of the other. Your selfish self gradually dissolves, giving way to the understanding that there are no others. We are all one. This is the goal of the game, the evolution of consciousness, from separation to unity, from fear to love. The final goal of the game seems to be less about reaching a paradise and more about reaching a new state of consciousness so expanded by empathy that the lessons of this world are no longer necessary. It is graduating from the school. Then you return to the source, but not as you left. You return enriched with the only treasure the source did not possess: wisdom born from experience and love forged in the fire of separation. Our investigation is complete. We started with a question and reached an answer that redefines everything. Life after death exists, but that is the wrong question. Death is just a part of life, and life is part of a divine game. Our purpose here goes beyond accumulating possessions, focusing instead on learning to love. Each difficulty is a lesson. Each enemy is a teacher in disguise. Numa gave us the map, but the journey each of us must make for ourselves. The game continues. If you enjoyed this analysis, your subscription to the channel helps us continue investigating themes like this. We would love to read your reflection on the subject in the comments and know which city you are joining us from.